U.S. President Barack Obama addresses the United Nations General Assembly and condemns the human suffering caused by the controversial president of Syria. Under-Secretary of State Richard Stango talks to VOA about ways to combat violent extremism. And an exclusive interview with President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya. Africa 54 starts right now.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. U.S. President Barack Obama on Monday used the world stage at the United Nations General Assembly to make his case for more diplomacy and collective international action to tackle some globe's biggest problems and hotspots. Some 200 world leaders are in New York for the annual diplomatic gathering. The president arrived at the United Nations prepared to address the need for greater human rights around the world, the conflict in Ukraine, the fight against the Islamic State, and the need to counter the violent extremism and terrorism that it perpetrates across the Middle East. One of the items Mr. Obama spoke most strongly about was the ongoing civil war in Syria and the human suffering caused by Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad.
Nowhere is our commitment to international order more tested than in Syria. When a dictator slaughters tens of thousands of his own people, that is not just a matter of one nation's internal affairs. It breeds human suffering on an order of magnitude that affects us all. Likewise, when a terrorist group beheads captives, slaughters the innocent, and enslaves women, it's not a single nation's national security problem. That is an assault on all our humanity.
Well, in keeping with his theme of more international cooperation and being proactive, when hotspots pop up, President Obama addressed the revolution that ousted former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi.
Where order has completely broken down, we must act. But we will be stronger when we act together. In such efforts, the United States will always do our part. We will do so mindful of the lessons of the past. Not just the lessons of Iraq, but also the example of Libya, where we joined an international coalition under a UN mandate to prevent a slaughter. Even as we helped the Libyan people bring an end to the reign of a tyrant, our coalition could have and should have done more to fill a vacuum left behind. We're grateful to the United Nations for its efforts to forge a unity government. We will help any legitimate Libyan government as it works to bring the country together. But we also have to recognize that we must work more effectively in the future as an international community to build capacity for states that are in distress before they collapse.
Well, for more on President Barack Obama's address at the UN General Assembly and his strongly worded comments about Syria and Libya, VOA UN correspondent Margaret Bashir-Jones is live from the UN in New York. Margaret?
Hello, Vincent. So, yeah, some very interesting remarks on Libya and Syria. On Libya, I think it was a bit of a preemptive remark on President Obama's part because the Russians love to bring up Libya when they talk about the United States and all the things that we do wrong in their eyes. So I think that President Obama brought up Libya and sort of defended the U.S. and the coalition, but admitted also that more could and should have been done to prevent these power vacuums that we know have now led to two rival governments in Libya and the growth, the expansion of the Islamic State, the so-called Islamic State in Libya, and have led to great flows of migrants from Libya going across the Mediterranean to Italy. So he did touch upon it, and in fact, President Putin just spoke here, and he did bring up Libya and spoke about how countries grossly misused a UN Security Council resolution authorizing action there. So it did come up, yes.
Now,
and Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, now,
No, go ahead, Vincent.
talking about Syria, talking about the fight against extremism, President Obama talked about cooperating with other nations. And here people are looking at Russia and looking at Iran. Is that the biggest challenge in this fight?
Yeah, well, I think that was really a headline out of the speech that the U.S. would cooperate with Iran on Syria. But Mr. Obama was very clear. We will not allow President Assad to stay in power. As you played that clip, he speaks about his use of chemical weapons and indiscriminate bombing of his population, and he has lost his legitimacy in the eyes of the United States. So this, I don't know how that's going to play out, because Russia and Iran are Mr. Assad's two main allies, and President Putin was on a U.S. news program last night and speaking about Assad and, basically saying, well, what's the alternative? Islamic State? So he's sort of still very close with Mr. Assad, and he has expanded his military presence in that country in the last couple weeks. So it will be interesting to see where that goes. And today, Mr. Putin and Mr. Obama will be having their first meeting in many, many months. So we'll have to stay tuned to see what comes out of that.
And we know that other leaders are speaking, but also King of Jordan spoke and dwelt so much on the issue of ISIS. Now, a leader like the King of Jordan, does he bring the kind of go-between position, or rather middle ground position in the fight against ISIS here?
Well, Jordan is a frontline country, not just in the fight against ISIS, but in absorbing the refugees that are fleeing from Syria and from Iraq. So they have over 1 million refugees in Jordan. So they're really struggling under this burden. And so he definitely is somebody that world leaders are here to hear from. And Jordan's participation in this international effort is crucial. They're a key partner.
Yes, tell us a little more of what you expect from the leaders who are going to speak today, and especially African leaders.
Well, we are waiting to hear from President Buhari of Nigeria this afternoon. I would expect him to speak about Boko Haram. President Kenyatta is speaking today, so I'm sure we'll hear about al-Shabaab. I mean, terrorism is definitely a topic, not just in the speeches of individual leaders, but it's a topic on the agenda here at this annual meeting of world leaders at the UN. It's a very front and center subject, and tomorrow President Obama will be leading a summit on countering extremism, so we can expect to hear more on the subject tomorrow as well at that event.
And now, every leader comes and talks about quite a number of things. You talked about a particular theme for this year. Do some of these other issues sometimes tend to overwhelm the area that it should be of greater focus here?
Well, I think everyone thinks their issue is the most important issue, but I think certainly this year we're going to hear so much on the refugee and migrant crisis that's developed in Europe, and we're going to hear a lot on countering terrorism and on the so-called Islamic State. So these are going to be two of the really main topics, and they both tie into the crisis in Syria. And so we have to see some sort of resolution of this crisis. The Secretary General opened the GA this morning, and he said that 100 million people around the world are in need of humanitarian assistance, and that the UN has appealed for $20 billion this year, $20 billion, to help people in conflict and crisis zones. And so it's overwhelming. And President Obama did make the point that we have to work together. We have to have international cooperation. No one country can solve everything on their own. And if we don't work together, we're going to suffer the consequences.
Well, Margaret, thank you very much for your reporting there. Viewers, Margaret Bashir reporting live from New York. Margaret will join us again on Tuesday for more coverage of the UNGA. And now, President Barack Obama is expected to meet with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin on Monday. And the White House says Mr. Obama has accepted Putin's invitation for a chance to address Russia's interference in Ukraine. However, a Russian government official says Mr. Putin wants to discuss Syria. Viewers, Laditsa Hoke reports.
The American and Russian presidents last spoke by phone in July to discuss the Iran nuclear deal. Their relations have been cool since Russia's annexation of Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula and its military support for pro-Russian separatists in Ukraine.
That is a clear violation of the territorial integrity of that sovereign nation.
But a Russian government spokesman said Putin wants to discuss Syria. Moscow has dispatched military aircraft and heavy arms to support Syrian government forces in fighting rebels and Islamic State militants. The move is part of Putin's plan to increase Russia's geopolitical influence, says National Defense Institute professor Peter Yeltsov.
He wants the world to focus on his involvement in Syria, on him fighting ISIS and trying to create a new coalition, as he claimed, to fight ISIS, and to completely forget about Ukraine.
The United States opposes Russia's support for the oppressive regime of President Bashar al-Assad.
President Obama will make clear once again that Russia doubling down on their support for the Assad regime is a losing bet. The likely consequence of them doing so is only to deepen and expand the ongoing crisis in that country. That doesn't serve the interests of either the Russian people or the American people.
But the European Union, overwhelmed by the influx of refugees fleeing the region, may go along with Putin's effort, at least for a while, said Yeltsov. Putin could even gain some concessions if he manages to wrest back some of the territory from Islamic State. But in the long run, Russia's involvement is likely to backfire, he said.
He forgot about Russia's experience in Afghanistan. He forgot when empires overextend, they tend to fall. So in the end of the day, this campaign may bury him.
Obama is expected to encourage Russia to join coalition efforts to combat Islamic State. Yeltsov said for now it may be best to let Putin fight in Syria and focus on preventing his takeover of eastern Ukraine. Zlatica Hoke, VOA News, Washington.
Well, more than 100 youth activists and government officials from dozens of countries are in New York this week participating in the Global Youth Summit against violent extremism. The event is co-hosted by the U.S. State Department Counter-Extremism Project and Search for Common Ground, and the Secretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, Richard Stengel, is among the senior U.S. officials speaking at the event. The U.S. State Department correspondent Pam Dawkins sat down with him and asked him about the State Department's work to counter violent extremism.
The idea is that the President wants to convene world leaders to really focus on this at UNGA. And so there's a kind of more kinetic aspect to it, which is focusing on anti-ISIL, and then there's a larger, broader effort, which we call CVE, Countering Violent Extremism, which has all kinds of manifestations: education, civil society, media. So that it will be a very broad focus.
Specifically, what are some of the aspects that you hope to discuss with countering violent extremism in meetings with heads of states from other countries, and how do you hope to use this as a follow-up?
Well, again, one of the sets of things that we're focused on is the globalization of ISIL, or Daesh as we call it, which is the Arabic name. So there will be conversations with world leaders in those countries where ISIL is actually growing and are creating their own kind of markets there. So that's one thing. Then there's the kind of, again, not softer so much, but the kind of countering violent extremism that has to do with educational exchanges, with programs where we deal with people who are returning back to their community, former fighters, the rehabilitation of young men and women who may have actually gone and fought for an extremist group. So it runs that whole gamut of hard to soft.
Specifically, what are some of the aspects that you hope to discuss with countering violent extremism in meetings with heads of states from other countries, and how do you hope to use this as a follow-up to the President's earlier initiative?
Well, one of the things that's under me as Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy is the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications, which was set up under Secretary Clinton to counter al-Qaeda messaging, and then it morphed into a full-time counter-ISIL messaging machine. And as you mentioned, ISIL is very sophisticated in social media, but actually I think the scales are shifting. I mean, if you look at what the volume of messaging that they are doing, and not just U.S. messaging to counter it, but messaging by Muslims around the world, that share is actually growing. So I actually always say that we're not the best messenger for our message. Obviously, a lot of people who are attracted to ISIL are anti-U.S. So part of what we do at CSCC is to enlist third-party groups, non-governmental organizations, other media businesses to to...
One of the things that you were involved in was in July you launched the Sawab Counterterrorism Center in Abu Dhabi. The focus is on countering, of course, the propaganda from the Islamic State. How is that doing?
It's doing well. It's a big signpost in our counter-ISIL campaign. It's a joint effort between the United Arab Emirates and the U.S., the Sawab Center. Sawab is Arabic for the right path. And this is part of our strategy, which is not to focus on American versus ISIL messaging. That isn't the ballgame. It's the whole rest of the Islamic world versus ISIL. So we want to create a network of networks of different hubs, the first of which is the Sawab Center. So they have about more than 10,000 followers. They're on many, many tweets and pieces of social media every day, and they're gaining attention and followers even as we speak.
Well, I want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is Africa 54, and check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com. Find me on Twitter at VOA Vince Makori. Well, now coming up, exclusive interview with President Uhuru Kenyatta of Kenya. Stay with us.
Wherever you are, Voice of America is on air, reaching more than 130 million weekly, worldwide, in more than 40 languages. Online, social media, and breaking news from around the world. On the go, dozens of new features on popular platforms with new apps and trending topics. Voice of America, on air, online, on the go.
I am Sheikh Sali, host and senior editor of VOA's international call-in talk show, Straight Talk Africa.
Today we'll examine the tobacco industry.
We pretty much touch on anything that you can think of. Politics, health issues, human rights issues, you name it, we talk about it. The issues that we discuss are pertinent to most people on the African continent. A very, very rare and unique opportunity to interact with their leaders.
Well, Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta is in New York for the United Nations General Assembly and a series of other meetings on the sidelines. On Saturday, he spoke exclusively to VOA on various subjects. My colleague Esther Githu-Yuwat is back from New York and has our report. Esther.
Yes, you're right, Vincent. President Kenyatta spoke about various issues and called for global action to reduce inequality, which he says is an achievable goal for both Kenya and Africa. Mr. Kenyatta said narrowing the gap of inequality is within reach if there's political goodwill and understanding that basic issues like health, gender equality, education and even access to clean water are a necessity for all.
I believe it is an achievable objective, especially if we can get the global community to work together and to focus keenly on this agenda. It is indeed workable. I believe it is workable if we get commitment and clear, concise, thought-out programs.
Kenyatta says developing countries should be given their fair share of global trade. He says the developed countries would not have to deal with issues such as migration problems currently being experienced in certain parts of the world if developing nations can sustain themselves.
I believe it is not impossible when we say we want to get greater equity in world trade, when we say that developing countries are not getting their fair share in terms of global trade, thereby denying opportunities within Africa, denying opportunities in developing countries, and ultimately creating more problems in terms of migration and so on and so forth for the developed world.
On terrorism challenges facing Kenya, President Kenyatta says his administration is investing heavily in security sector to counter the threat of terrorism and extremism.
The threat of terrorism, again, is a threat not just to Kenya, it's a global threat. Yeah? And we are working with our international partners in close collaboration to see how we can handle that particular threat, how we can handle the issue of extremism.
And on the political crisis in South Sudan, Mr. Kenyatta and regional leaders have been steering peace negotiations. However, President Salva Kiir of South Sudan and rebel leader Riek Machar have not been able to agree on key issues. Mr. Kenyatta says regional leaders would like to see an end to the stalemate, but also active engagement in the peace process by all parties, such as the civil society organizations and the community in general.
We have made progress. We have gotten both parties now to sign the peace agreement. We have gotten both sides to see the need for peace. We are continuing to engage with them actively on the sidelines of the General Assembly. We are having a session to discuss South Sudan.
Although peace remains elusive in South Sudan, Mr. Kenyatta is hopeful and says the key focus now is to implement the peace agreement, and this will require regional and international communities' involvement to help establish the formation of a government of national unity. Now we'll have more on our exclusive interview with Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta in our upcoming broadcasts. Vincent?
Well, good job, Esther. Thank you very much. Now, the World Health Organization announced Friday that Nigeria has been removed from the list of polio-endemic countries, a key step in the future eradication of the disease. The organization says Nigeria has gone more than a year without a recorded case of wild polio virus. Once Nigeria has gone 3 years without reporting a case of the virus, the country can be declared polio-free. The Global Polio Eradication Initiative, the public-private partnership that is leading the effort to eradicate polio, called the development a historic achievement. There are now only 2 polio-endemic countries, that is Pakistan and Afghanistan, where there are active cases of the disease. Well, Pope Francis is back at the Vatican after wrapping up his 3-city tour of America by touching on many recurring themes of his papacy, especially empathy for society's downtrodden. VOA's Robert Raphael has this recap of the Pontiff's Philadelphia farewell.
Pope Francis received a warm welcome Sunday morning from bishops at the seminary where he had been staying during his Philadelphia visit. The Vatican said that earlier, the Pope met privately with 5 victims of sexual abuse, some at the hands of priests. Many victims say the Vatican has not done enough to address the decades-long scandal. But after Sunday's meeting, the pontiff vowed to hold accountable anyone who abuses children.
Lo lamento profundamente. Dios llora.
God weeps for the sexual abuse of children.
Los crímenes y pecados de los abusos sexuales a menores.
These cannot be maintained in secret.
The Pope then traveled to a Philadelphia jail where he was presented with a wooden chair, hand carved by inmates. Pope Francis has repeatedly voiced his opposition to the death penalty and did so again during this U.S. visit. He told the prisoners no human being is unworthy of redemption.
Ya que una sociedad, una familia que no sabe sufrir los dolores de sus hijos.
Any society, any family which cannot share or take seriously the pain of its children and views that pain as something normal or to be expected is a society condemned to remain a hostage to itself, prey to the very things which cause pain. I am here as a pastor, but above all as a brother, to share your situation and to make it my own.
Later, it was time for another trip in the Pope Mobile among hundreds of thousands of admirers en route to his final Mass of the visit in downtown Philadelphia. During the massive open-air service, he told the crowd that love is best shown by what he called life's little gestures, especially in the home.
Son gestos de madre.
These are the little gestures done by mothers, by grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers, by children and siblings. They're little signs of tenderness, of affection, and compassion.
Later Sunday evening, Vice President Biden led the farewell delegation for Pope Francis as his plane departed the U.S. for the return flight to Vatican City. Robert Raphael, VOA News, Washington.
Well, it's time now for a short break. Still to come on Africa 54. Kenyans win Berlin Marathon. We'll be right back.
If you've just joined us, I'm Mariama Diallo, and here is a quick recap of today's headlines. In Burkina Faso, the army says the elite presidential guard behind a recent coup attempt is refusing to be disarmed. In the Central African Republic, at least 20 people are dead and about 100 wounded after gunmen attack a predominantly Christian neighborhood in Bangui. In Nigeria, gunmen thought to be Boko Haram attacked a northeast village, leaving 9 dead and at least 10 injured. Finally, a Chinese president met with Nigerian leader Muhammadu Buhari in New York, emphasizing a need to raise cooperation between the two countries.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Well, it's time for Monday's Sports Report, and here's Sunny Young with the sunny side of sports. Sunny, I understand that Kenyans won big in Germany, right?
Another big win for the Kenyans, Vincent. Sporty greetings once again to our Africa 54 viewers. Kenya is celebrating another sweep of the men's and women's titles at a major international marathon. On a beautiful morning in the German capital, more than 40,000 runners lined up for the 42nd BMW Berlin Marathon. After the starting gun fired, top African runners shot to the lead as the drums beat in Berlin. Eliud Kipchoge, who won the London Marathon in April, added the Berlin crown to his impressive athletic resume by clocking 2 hours and 4 minutes even. Well done, Eliud. And after Kipchoge waved the Kenyan flag, another Kenyan, Gladys Cherono, won the women's race in 2 hours, 19 minutes and 25 seconds. Both Cherono and Kipchoge say they hope to represent Kenya at next year's Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I'm VOA's Sunny Young, and that's the sunny side of sports. Vincent?
Well, thanks a lot, Sunny, and be sure to watch the sunny side of sports every Monday and Friday right here on Africa 54. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. For more news, tune in to VOA's evening radio show, Africa News Tonight at 1800 UTC. And in the mornings, today, Break Africa between 0300 and 0600 UTC, Monday through Friday. Thanks a lot for watching from all of us here in Washington. Have a good night.
At stake is the basic human right of the woman and child.
This is a struggle against humanity, and we all need to join hands and do what we can do.
Women are not being heard, so we need to be doing a lot more.
A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. I'm Sally Field, and I believe women are the best agents of change. These women from around the world are leading the way to challenge the status quo and motivate the next generation.
Let's move on and take a step in this journey.
Access to preventive care information and access to health care is a fundamental right.
It really makes me think about how I can contribute to the next generation.
These women bring us one step closer to realizing women's rights as human rights. Only on VOA.